Alright, let's see how to configure Kasm Autoscaling with Proxmox on the back end. First things first, let's configure the Proxmox environment. The first thing you need to do is to create a resource pool. So go to your data center, go to permissions, and then click on pools, create a new pool. I'll just name it as Kasm Autoscale new. Click OK. Next, you can also create a dedicated user that you can use specifically for Kasm Autoscaling. You don't have to do this, you can use an existing account, but we recommend you create a dedicated account to use with Kasm. So once again, I'll go to permissions and then users, click on add. I'll name the user as Kasm Autoscale user. And then select the realm to Proxmox VE authentication server, click add, and a new user has now been created. We need to then create an API token, so go to API tokens, click on add, choose the user that you just created, which in my case is Kasm Autoscale user at PVE. If you're using an existing Proxmox account, then you can enable privilege suppression. But since we have created a new user account to use with Kasm, I'll uncheck privilege suppression. And you also need to define your token ID. I'll just say Kasm Autoscale new, click add. This is going to generate your token ID and secret. Make sure you save them securely because you need to input these to Kasm later and you will not be able to see these again. So copy paste them somewhere safe. Next, we need to create a role. So I'll go to roles, click on create, and I'll create a new role called Kasm Autoscale role. And the privileges that you need to set are pool.audit, VM allocate, data store allocate space, SDN use, VM audit, VM clone, VM config CPU, VM config CD-ROM, VM config disk, hardware type, memory, network, options, VM monitor, and finally VM power management. So these are all the privileges that you need to assign to your role. All of these privileges can be found in our documentation. So once you have the right privileges, just click on create and a new role has now been created. Finally, you also need to associate or assign the appropriate permissions to your user account. So I'll go to permissions, click on add, user permissions. The first permission that you need to add is SDN/zone/local network. Select the appropriate user and then also give it the role that we just created. Click add. We need to create two more permissions. So I'll go to add, user permission again, and this time I'll add a permission called storage/local LVM. Select the right user, select the right role, click add, and one more time, click add, user permission. And this time the permission is pool/ followed by the resource pool that you just created, which is Kasm Autoscale new in my case. Give the right user and the right role, click add. So those are all the configurations or settings that you need to do on your Proxmox environment so that it works properly with Kasm Autoscaling. Now, before we go ahead and configure autoscaling on Kasm, we need to also create a Linux VM template so that Kasm can talk to Proxmox to provision a new Linux VM and install the Kasm Docker agent on it. So I'll be using Ubuntu Server 24.04. You can use any other Linux distro of your choice as long as Kasm supports it. The list of supported operating systems are listed on our documentation, so make sure you refer to them first before choosing your target operating system. So you can go ahead and download the Ubuntu server from this link. I've already downloaded it. So I'll go back to my Proxmox environment. I'll go to PVE, go to local, and then go to ISO images. And over here, you can go ahead and upload the ISO image of Ubuntu server. Just click on upload, select file, and just upload the ISO image. I'm not going to do that because I already have it uploaded. If you can see, Ubuntu 24.04.2 live server AMD64.ISO. This is the ISO image. This is the installation media that I'm going to use to install Ubuntu on my VM and then create a template from that VM. All right, so the next step is to actually create a VM and then install Ubuntu on the VM. So I'll click on create VM on the top right corner, and I'll name it as Ubuntu Server Template. And then I'll choose the resource pool, which is Kasm Autoscale new. Click next. You can let the storage be local. And then the ISO image, this is where you choose the uploaded ISO image, which is this one. Set the type to Linux. Click next. And make sure here in the SCSI controller, you select VirtIO SCSI single and also enable QEMU agent. Click next. So this is where you actually set the size of your disk. So you can set this based on your requirements. Obviously, if you're planning to have, or if you're planning to host multiple workspace images, then you would require more space, but I'm just gonna let this be 32 gigs. And then also make sure that you set the bus to VirtIO block. Click next. And here is where you can configure the number of CPUs that you want to allocate to your VM. I'll just set this to 2. And also make sure that you set the type to host. Click next. Set the RAM you want to allocate. I'll just set this to 4 gigs. Click next again. And this is where you can configure your network. Make sure that the model is set to VirtIO para virtualized and click on next. And that should be all the configurations that you need to do. Just click on finish. And this is going to go ahead and create a new VM for you to use. So this is my newly created VM. I'll just right click and select start and then double click on it to open up the web VNC. And I'll go ahead and install Ubuntu. Select the language, choose Ubuntu server. Done. Continue. Give a name to your server. I'll just name it as Teja Kasm. Pick a username, pick a password. I'm also going to select install OpenSSH server because I want to be able to log in to my provisioned instances with SSH. We don't want to install any additional tools. Once the installation is done, you can just select reboot now. And while this is rebooting, go back to your Proxmox environment, select the VM that you just created, go to hardware and double click on CD/DVD drive. And we need to now remove the installation ISO file. So just select do not use any media here and click OK. Come back, hit enter, and this is now going to reboot from the actual disk where Ubuntu is installed. All right, let me log in. And I'm in. So this interface that I have right here is the no VNC window. I would like to log into my VM via SSH. So I'll first get my IP address. I'll install NetTools first. And then type ifconfig. And this is the IP address. So let me open up my terminal here and let me SSH into my VM instance. 192.168.100.153. Yes, put in my password here and I'm now in. So I can now go ahead and close this VNC window because I'm now logged in via SSH. So the first thing that you can do here is to actually put your SSH public key in the list of authorized keys so you can log in to your VM instance using your SSH private key. So let me go ahead and copy my SSH public key first and let me open up SSH/authorized keys and I'll paste my SSH public key here. So now I'll be able to log in to my provisioned instances with my SSH private key without having to type in the password. You can also go ahead and disable password authentication so that you can only log in to your VM instances via SSH with public key authentication and not password authentication. Anyway, so the next thing you need to do is to actually install the QEMU guest agent tool. So I'll just go ahead and do sudo apt update first and then install the QEMU guest agent tools, start the tools, and then also enable them. So then I'll go ahead and reboot my VM. So now let me see the status of the QEMU guest agent tools to make sure that they are properly installed. And there you go, the QEMU guest agent tools are installed and are properly loaded. And finally, you also need to reset your machine identity so that you can generate a template from it later. So I'll just go ahead and execute these two truncate commands, which is going to reset my machine ID. And that's it. I'll now go ahead and shut down this VM. I'll go back to Proxmox, right click and select stop. And once the VM is powered off, I'll right click on it again and select convert to template. Click on yes, and the VM has now been converted into a template. So now you can go to your Kasm Workspaces deployment, and the first thing that you need to check is your upstream auth address. Go to infrastructure and then go to zones, and then edit your zone. And over here in the upstream auth address, by default, this value is going to be set to proxy, but you need to change this to the actual IP or fully qualified domain name of your Kasm deployment. So in my case, it's 192.168.100.174. Now this change is very important, and if you do not make this change, autoscaling is simply not going to work. The reason behind this is that in order for autoscaling to work properly, Kasm needs to talk to Proxmox, obviously, to create and provision new VMs for you. But once the VMs are provisioned on Proxmox, those VMs also need to report back to Kasm to tell Kasm that they have come online and are ready to use. So they need to properly know the correct location where your Kasm deployment exists. So in other words, it's very important for your provisioned VMs to be able to access or talk to your Kasm deployment. So make sure you set this to the IP or FQDN of your Kasm deployment and click on Save. And then I'll go to Pools, click on Add, and I'll create a new pool called Docker Agent Pool. I'll select the type to Docker Agent, click on Save. Now I'll go to All Autoscale Configs, click on Add. I'll name this as Proxmox Docker Autoscale. Select Autoscale type to Docker Agent, select the pool, select the deployment zone, and the downscale backoff is the amount of time that Kasm will wait before it deprovisions your VM instances. So I'll just set this to 100 seconds. Standby cores is the number of cores that Kasm always tries to maintain as available. So if the number of actual cores that are available fall below the standby cores, Kasm will go ahead and provision a new VM instance to satisfy the standby cores value. So I'll just set this to 4 cores. Same concept for standard GPUs. I'll just set this to 0 because I don't want to use any GPUs. Same concept for standby memory. I'll set this to 6 gigs. Agent cores override is where you can actually override the cores of the provisioned VM. So if you set this to like 2 cores, then Kasm will only see the 2 cores out of the 4 available cores. You can also over provision it, for example, and set this to 6 cores. And when you set this to 6 cores, Kasm will assume that your new agent has 6 cores, even though in reality it only has 4 cores. Ideally, you can set it in such a way that it matches your standby cores. So I'll set it to 4, GPUs to 0, and memory to 6. Click on Next, and over here you can configure the provider specific details. I'll select the provider as Proxmox, set the name to Proxmox Docker config. The number of maximum instances that you want Kasm to be able to provision on Proxmox, I'll set this to 2. The host of your Proxmox environment, so I'll just copy my host value. You don't need to have a schema like HTTP or HTTPS, just the host value will be enough. And then the username is the user account that you created. In my case, let me go back to my users, and this is the user that I created. So if I double click on it, I can see the username. I'll just copy this username and paste it here. The token name is the name of the token that you just created. So if you go back to your Proxmox and then go to API tokens, you can find your created token here. In my case, this is the token that I created earlier. So I'll just copy the token name and paste it here. The token value is a secret that got generated when creating your token. So I'll just copy, paste it here. Verify SSL is whether you want to validate SSL certificates. My Proxmox environment has no valid SSL certs, so I'm just going to disable this. But ideally, you would want to enable this. VMID range lower, you can set this to anything, but make sure it doesn't overlap with the VMIDs that you already have on Proxmox. So I'll set this to 1000. I'll set the upper range to 2000. You can enable full clone for a faster performance, but enabling full clone also means that it's going to take longer to provision a VM. So I'm just going to disable this so that the VM provisioning is faster for the demo purposes. Template name is the name of the template. So I'll go back, and this is the template that I created. So I'll just copy the template name and paste it here. Cluster node name, I'll set this to PVE. Resource pool name is the name of the resource that you created. Once again, go back to permissions and then pools, and this is the name of the resource pool. I'll just copy it, paste it here. Target node name. So you can set this to the Proxmox node where you want the VM to be provisioned on. If you leave it blank, it will be defaulted to the cluster node name. So I'm just going to leave it blank. The number of cores that you want to allocate to your VM, I'll set this to 4. The amount of memory, I'll set this to 8. Installed OS type is going to be Linux. Startup script path is where you want the startup script to be uploaded. I'll just set this to /temp. And finally comes the startup script. So you can find example startup scripts on our GitHub. In this demo, I'm just going to use this script right here. It's a bash script. And basically what it does is it installs the Kasm agent role and reports back to your Kasm deployment. So I'm just going to copy this script. Once again, these scripts are on our public GitHub repo and the link will be in the description below. So I'll copy this, paste it here. There is a small modification that I'll be making here. Since I did not configure an Nginx certificate and key, I'm just going to remove these 3 lines. And starting from the 117 version, we no longer take Nginx key and Nginx cert while creating autoscale config. So these are no longer valid. So I'm just going to remove these 3 lines here and that should be it. I'll just click on finish and Kasm should now go ahead and provision new VM instances on your Proxmox. As you can see, a new VM instance has already been created. Actually, 2 of them have been created to maintain the standby cores value that I put, and both of them are now coming online. So you can see the IP address is also assigned to both of these VMs. If you go back to Kasm Workspaces and then go to Docker agents, you can see the 2 newly provisioned Docker agents are listed here, but the status for both these agents is still in starting, and this will be changed to running when the Kasm agent has been installed on the VMs and when the VMs report back to Kasm. So that's going to take a little while, and to track the progress of this, you can actually SSH into your VMs. So let me go ahead and SSH into this VM. I'll open my terminal here and I'll say SSH Teja at 192.168.100.147. If I list the files in /temp, you can see the scripts that are required to install the Kasm agent are downloaded. So that's a sign that the startup script that we configured on Kasm earlier is working and it's now being executed. Let me go back to Kasm and refresh this page again. And there you go. You can see both of these agents are now in the running state and they are also reporting back. The last reported time is 16 seconds for this agent and 21 seconds for this agent. So that's a good sign. That means that the Kasm agent has been installed and it has reported back to Kasm. And you can also cross-check that from your SSH session. If you just type in sudo docker ps, you can see we have 2 containers running, Kasm web/proxy and Kasm web/agent. So the Kasm agent is installed properly. So once these agents report to Kasm, Kasm will then go ahead and download or pull all the existing workspace images to those newly provisioned agents. If you have a long list of workspace images, then obviously it's going to take longer to pull all those images to the newly provisioned Docker agents. But once again, you can go to logging and you can just search for pull, and you can then find the logs that reflect the status of downloading these images. For example, you can look at this log over here and you can see it says it has successfully pulled the Chrome image to the new Kasm agent. So if I go back to my SSH session and I type in sudo docker images, you can see the Chrome workspace is indeed downloaded. You can also cross-check this by going to workspaces, actually going to admin, go to workspaces, and then edit the workspace, scroll down, and you can actually restrict this image to a Kasm agent and select one of the 2 newly provisioned Kasm agents. Let's see. Let's go ahead and choose this one right here. So I'll restrict it to this agent. Click on save. So now whenever you launch this workspace, it's only going to be launched on the selected agent. So let's go ahead and test this. Let me launch this session. And there you go. The session is now launched. This can also be cross-checked from your SSH connection. If I do sudo docker ps, you can see the Chrome container running. So I'll go ahead and delete this session. And if you want to deprovision all the agents that Kasm has provisioned, kind of like a way to reset your environment, you can do that by going to admin, go to infrastructure, go to pools, go to all autoscale configs, edit your autoscale config, scroll down and set the downscale back off to 0, standby cores to 0, standby GPUs to 0, and standby memory to 0. Click next and click finish. This is going to tell Kasm to deprovision all the autoscaled agents. So if I go back to my Proxmox environment, you can see that the newly provisioned VMs have now disappeared. The same thing, it can be cross-checked on Kasm. If you go to Docker agents, you can see there is only one default agent and the two newly provisioned agents are now deprovisioned and they are no longer listed here. Alright, now let's see how to configure Windows Autoscaling on Kasm with Proxmox backend. Just like with the Docker Agent Autoscaling, make sure you created a new pool, a new user, assign the appropriate roles and permissions to that new user, and also generate a new API token so that you can use it with Kasm. Assuming you have all that set up, the next step is to create a Windows template. So you can go to your local storage, go to ISO images, select upload, and then upload the Windows ISO image file. In this demo, I'll be using the Windows Server 2022, which I downloaded from this website. Make sure you download the ISO version and not the other extensions. So I have already uploaded it. This is my ISO file that I just uploaded. So I'm going to use this to create a VM. So I'll select create VM on the top right corner. I'll name this as Windows Server 2022 template. I select the resource pool to Kasm Autoscale new, which is the resource pool that I created earlier. Click next. I'll select the ISO image of my Windows installation media and make sure you select the guest OS type to Windows, and also select this box that says add additional drive for VirtIO drivers and select the ISO image of the VirtIO drivers. You can download this from this website over here. I downloaded this one, which is VirtIO Win 0.1.266.ISO. So I have downloaded it and I uploaded it to my Proxmox the same way I did for the Windows ISO file. So I'll select that ISO here, click next. Make sure the machine type is set to Q35. The SCSI controller is set to VirtIO SCSI single, and also enable QEMU agent. And you don't need EFI disks, so just disable this and also disable TPM. Click next. Set the bus or device to SCSI and set the cache to write back. And over here you get to choose the amount of size that you want to allocate to your VM. I'll just set this to 45 gigs. Click next. I'll set the cores to 4 and set the type to host. Click next. I'll set the memory to 4 gigs. Click next. And in the network settings, make sure the model is set to VirtIO para virtualized. Click next and click finish. So this is going to create a new VM, and once it's created, just right click on it and select start, and then double click on it to open the no VNC window, and just press any key so that you boot from the Windows installation media, and now you can install Windows. Make sure you select the Windows Server 2022 standard desktop experience, click next, accept, next, install Windows only. And by default, you will not see any drives listed where you can install Windows. And that's because you do not have VirtIO storage controller installed yet. So just click on load driver here, click OK. Here it'll list all the VirtIO SCSI controllers that you can install. Select the appropriate version. I'll just choose the 2022 one, click next. And once the storage drivers are installed, you can now see your drive listed here. So I'll just select it, click next, and that's going to install Windows. So go ahead and choose a password for your admin account. Go ahead and log in. And I'm now logged into my Windows Server 2022. The first thing I'll do is I will make sure the server manager do not pop up whenever a new session is started. So I'll disable that on startup. And then I'll open my file explorer, go to my VirtIO drive, and run the 64-bit installer to install all the other required drivers like the network driver. Click next, accept, next. So these are all the additional drivers that will be installed. Technically, you only need the first two, which is balloon and network, but I'm just going to install all the other drivers as well. Click next, install. And as you can see, the network driver is now installed and I can now access the internet. You also need to install the QEMU guest agent tools, and they can be found in the same virt.io drive. So go to your virt.io drive once again, and then go to guest agent, and then install the QEMU guest agent tools. Awesome. So the next step is to turn on RDP. So just search for remote desktop settings and enable remote desktop so that Kasm will be able to create sessions based on the RDP protocol. So once that is done, you can go ahead and reboot your VM instance. And you can now see on your Proxmox environment, it will now also list your VM's IP address. You can directly RDP into it. So I'm just going to close my VNC window, open up remote desktop connection, and connect to my VM instance. Awesome. So now I've connected to my VM instance with RDP. The next step, which is a very important step, is to set your PowerShell execution policy to unrestricted so that Kasm can execute a startup script when your VM is provisioned. So search for PowerShell in your start menu, right click on it, select run as administrator, and over here execute this command that says set execution policy unrestricted. Yes to all. And now the execution policy has been set to unrestricted, and Kasm can now run startup scripts. All right, so this is the time where you can actually install the software that you require on your VM. In this demo, I'll just simply run this PowerShell script that downloads and installs Microsoft Office. So I'm just going to copy paste it into my PowerShell window over here, and that's going to go ahead and install all the Microsoft Office tools. In the same way, you can install any custom tools or software that you would require on your Autoscale Windows VMs. Once you install all the required software, you can now go ahead and shut down your VM. And once the VM is in the turned off state, you can right click on it and select convert to template. Click yes, and this is going to convert our VM into a template so that we can input that to Kasm later. So here you can see the VM has been converted to the template. Now you can go to the hardware tab and you can remove the Windows ISO and the virt.io ISO. So just double click on it, select do not use any media, and do the same thing for the Windows ISO. Now I'll go back to my Kasm Workspaces. I'll go to infrastructure, pools, create a new pool. I'll call it server pool. Set the type to server, click save, go to all autoscale configs, click add. I'll set this to Proxmox server autoscale, autoscale type to server, select the pool, deployment zone, downscale back off. I'll set this to 100 seconds, and I'll enable Kasm desktop service installed and require server check-in. So what this means is that Kasm will expect the provisioned VM to report back to Kasm with the help of the Kasm desktop service, which will be installed in our startup script. I'll set the connection type to RDP. Connection port will be 3389, which is the default port, and you can choose different type of credentials like static credentials, SSO, dynamic user account, or you can even authenticate with smart card. More of this is covered in our documentation, but for this demo, I'll just choose static credentials, and I'll put in my admin credentials here. You can enable reusable if you want the same provisioned VM to be used for multiple users, but if you want to use a new VM for every new user request, then you can leave this disabled. I'll leave this disabled. I'll set the minimum available sessions to 1, set the maximum simultaneous sessions per server to 2, click on next, choose the provider as Proxmox. I'll name it as Proxmox Windows config. Maximum instances, I'll set this to 2. Proxmox host, I'll copy this and put it here. Username is going to be this right here. I'll copy paste it. Token name is going to be Kasm Autoscale new. You can find it by going to API tokens, and this is the token that I created. Just double click on it, and this is where you can find the token name. Just copy paste it. Token value, this is the secret that is generated. Paste it here. Verify SSL. If you want to validate SSL certificates, you can enable this, but I'm going to disable this because I don't have valid SSL certs. VM ID range, once again, make sure that this does not overlap with the existing VMs. I'm just going to set this to 2000, and for the upper range, I'll set it to 3000. You can enable full clone if you want a good performance, but if you enable this, it also means that provisioning the VM is going to take a longer time. For this demo, I'll just leave this disabled. For the template name, I'll choose the template that I just created, which is Windows Server 2022 template. The cluster node name, I'll set this to PVE. The resource pool name is the resource pool that I created, which is in permissions pools. This is the pool. Copy, paste it here. The target node name is the Proxmox node where you want the VMs to be provisioned. I'll just leave this to empty, so this will be defaulted to the cluster node name. In other words, if you leave this empty, the newly provisioned VMs will be placed under the cluster node name, which is PVE in this case. The number of cores, I'll set this to 4. I'll set the memory to 4. The installed OS type is going to be Windows. The startup script path is where you want the startup script to be uploaded. I'll set this to C, Windows temp. And the startup script, this can be found on our public GitHub repo. The link will be in the description below. So let me copy paste the PowerShell script over here. And basically what it does is it downloads and installs the necessary tools and software like the Kasm desktop agent that is required to report back to Kasm. That's it. I'll click on finish and this should trigger the auto scaling. If I go back to my Proxmox environment, Kasm should now provision a new VM. So I'll just wait for it to happen. There you go. You can see a new VM has been provisioned here, Kasm Dynamic Agent, and the VM ID is 2000. I'll just wait for this to provision properly because once it's provisioned, the startup script also needs to be executed, which will install the Kasm desktop agent and then report back to Kasm. So if you go back to your Kasm Workspaces and go to servers, still not listed over here, but it should soon be listed. There you go. Now it's listed and you can see the status is in starting. That means the Kasm desktop agent is yet to be installed, and only once it's installed, the VM can report back to Kasm. So I'm gonna wait for that. Meanwhile, if you want to track the progress of this, you can RDP into it. So let me do that. 152, you can find the IP address over here. Just RDP into that IP. So if I go to cd c windows temp to ls, you can see the Kasm startup script is uploaded to this directory. If I go to cd c users public downloads and do ls here, you can see the Kasm desktop installer is downloaded. So that's a good sign that our startup script is being executed. If I open the run menu and go to services.msc, once the Kasm desktop service is installed, you should be able to find it over here. And you can see the Kasm desktop service is indeed installed and it's in the running state. So that means if you go back to your Kasm Workspaces and just refresh your servers page, you can see that your newly provisioned server is now in the running state. So it's good to go. It's ready to use. So let me go ahead and create a new workspace so that I can show you that it works. I'll go to Workspaces, click on Add Workspace. I'll select the workspace type to Pool, set this to Windows Server 2022, same description, and select the appropriate pool. And you can also enable remote app if you want. For example, you can install the Excel remote app on your VM before creating the VM template, and you can enable this option to launch that remote app directly. Select the pool and you can also set a persistent profile path. And that's it. I'll click on save. Oops. Oh, you also need to choose the RDP client option. I'll select this to web native client so that the session opens up in your browser instead of an RDP window. Click on save. Go to Workspaces. Here's my new workspace. Let me go ahead and launch this. And there you go. I am now connected to my Windows Server VM from Kasm. So if another user or if the same user creates a new session of this Windows Server 2022, Kasm is going to go ahead and provision a new VM instance. So if I click on launch instance, it says requesting additional resources. So that means Kasm is now provisioning a new VM on Proxmox. As you can see, there is another agent that's created over here. So once this is in the running state, once the Kasm desktop agent is installed and it reports back, this session will then be created. So there you go. After a little while, once the new server has come online, you can see the session has now started. So if I now go back to my Kasm dashboard, go to infrastructure and then servers, you can now see I have 2 servers. Anyway, so let me go back and delete this session, delete the other session as well. So if you now want to deprovision all the VMs that Kasm has provisioned and want to reset your environment, you can do that by going to admin, go to infrastructure, go to pools, go to all autoscale configs and edit your autoscale config. Scroll down and set the downscale back off to 0, the minimum available sessions to 0 and the maximum simultaneous sessions per server to 0. Click next, click finish, and Kasm should now deprovision all the provisioned agents on Proxmox. You can see one agent has already disappeared from Proxmox, and there you go, the server no longer exists, and the same can be verified on Proxmox. You can see both the servers have now been deprovisioned and you're now back to where you started.